The whip cuts through the heavy air once more, the sound as sharp and gutting as a scream swallowed by the vast fields. It rings out in a pattern known all too well, a cruel rhythm that commands silence and submission, yet beneath the lash's echo, a deeper weight presses down, the burden of 1863's gathering tempest across the southern plantations. While the war rages beyond, here on this stretch of scorched earth and broken backs, the overseer holds sway like a merciless god, wielding his whip as both scepter and sentence. Cotton rows stretch in dull, unyielding lines beneath a sky that seems to brood with forgotten storms. The sun presses down with a thick, cloying heat that smothers breath and seeps into the skin like oil. Each slave cabin, its weathered wood softened to an ash gray, sits nestled in shadowed clusters, separated from the grandeur of the planter's house by distance and despair. The coarse fabric of rough-spun clothes, the cracked leather of worn boots, and the rusty iron shackles discarded in haste each speak of lives tethered to labor and violence. The overseer, a man shaped as much by the plantation system as he has shaped it in turn, prowls these fields with eyes as cold and unyielding as the iron tools dangling from his belt. The workers move with practiced precision, planting and harvesting under the weight of endless days. Their hands are cracked calluses, their backs bear the record of countless lashes. The overseer's whip does more than inflict pain, it writes fear into flesh and memory alike. Against this relentless oppression, murmurs rise like smoke beneath the lash's crack, whispers of exhaustion, of hope thin as a thread, and of quiet desperation. Yet, despite the tightening grip of this cruel regime, something taut and restless coils beneath their skin, an unmistakable pulse of resistance, desperate and yet unseen. Here in these hushed moments, as dusk threatens the day's last light, one wonders what happens when the instrument of cruelty is turned back upon its wielder. What secret reckonings do these acres hide beneath their furrowed soil? The overseer's grip tightens, but so too does the noose of fate, drawing inexorably closer with the cold certainty of iron and earth. The fields listen, and the whip waits for its final echo. The overseer, a figure threading the needle between planter and enslaved, wielded absolute authority over the day-to-day grind of plantation life. In 1863, as the nation fractured by war, this man remained an unyielding force in these fields of cotton and sorrow. His role demanded mastery not only of crop production, but the discipline of human bodies as if they were mere tools, their value measured by the length of their endurance under lash and labor. His hands were as hardened from the grip of the whip as those he supervised were scarred from receiving it. Responsibility for the slaves' health, nutrition, and even their scant clothing fell on his watch, an impossible task when weighed against the brutal quotas demanded by the planter. Yet the overseer's authority was a cage as much as a throne. He dwelt apart from both the planter's family and the enslaved, his modest house a grim sentinel at the edge of the slave quarters. Socially isolated, he bore the weight of impossible expectations to enforce strict order, curb any hint of defiance, and ensure productivity under the ever-watchful gaze of the absentee owner. His tenure was fragile, always at risk of dismissal for failing to meet the cruel standards set by wealth and fear. Days bled into nights under the oppressive southern heat, his eyes scanning rows of exhausted workers while his palms itched for the whip that would hold rebellion at bay. Every gesture the overseer made was shaped by this precarious balance of power and paranoia. His voice barked orders, and his gaze pierced the dim shadows of the slave cabins. Yet the ledger of his life was marked with frustration and loneliness. Few remained long enough to root themselves in the landscape or decipher the shifting whim of their employers. The plantation operated like a rigid machine, with the overseer as both its driver and its prisoner. Would the burden of such control and the cruelty it demanded unravel beneath its own weight? Might the whip's bite return unexpectedly to the hand that brandished it? In this fraught terrain, cruelty was currency and silence a thin shield. The overseer's whip cracked again, not merely a tool, but a signal, a punctuation of power that sought to erase defiance before it could bloom. Yet the workers beneath the lash whispered in the shadows, binding their fears and hopes in a tight, aching coil. Could vengeance rise from these hushed spaces, unseen but inevitable? The overseer's dominion tightened, but in the pulse of his tightening grip, a darker reckoning waited buried beneath the soil and whispered in the night air. The slave quarters stood cramped and weather-worn, their rough timbers smelling of smoke, sweat, and damp clay, a fragile refuge from the relentless demands of the fields. Here, time moved with the heavy, slow weight of existence tethered to forced labor, where the smallest sign of respite was coveted as fiercely as freedom itself. The year was 1863, and the upheavals beyond these plantation borders, the distant thunder of war and the crackling of emancipation's promise, offered a faint, flickering hope that barely penetrated the gloom. Inside, the rhythm remained merciless. Dawn's first light woke the enslaved to grueling days, their bodies bent beneath cotton bowls, their hands stained and raw. Their ragged clothing, patched and fraying, clung to skin hardened by heat and toil, shifting with each repeated motion of planting or picking. The air was thick with the scent of overripe earth, mingled with the metallic tang that came from coarse tools forged to exact their labor. Under an overseer whose stare was sharper than the sun's glare, the plantation operated with militant precision. He was the keeper of order and terror, his whip a cruel metronome, setting the pace for sweating limbs and aching backs. Punishments, often swift and merciless, were both spectacle and warning, a mechanism to crush rebellion before it could take root. Records imply that overseers wielded this authority with capricious cruelty, driven as much by fear of losing control as by personal brutality. Yet many enslaved endured, weaving their strength with whispered stories and stolen moments in hidden gardens where select vegetables and herbs were coaxed from the soil. These gardens were sanctuaries and small acts of defiance, offering brief solace amid the suffocating hierarchy. The harsh ration of salted pork and cornmeal, supplemented only by what could be foraged or cultivated under vigilant eyes, was a constant reminder of dependence and scarcity. Would you feel the grinding weight of such captivity, where every breath is measured against a revolving calendar of labor, pain, and faint hope? The overseer's presence was a daily specter, his boots stirring dust and dread along the heavy paths between cabins. Each lash that cracked open flesh also echoed the chasms carved deep in the soul. Yet beneath the oppressive cycle, nervous hands worked quietly, sewing, mending, whispering, seeds of resistance, as old and tangled as the roots beneath the cotton fields. The whip might command the body, but it could not yet claim the spirit. As shadows lengthened over furrowed rows, the tightening grip of the overseer's control drew ever closer to a reckoning that no one dared yet voice aloud. The slave quarters murmured, with restrained fear and cautious hope, where acts of quiet rebellion wove through the daily grind like an undercurrent of restless water beneath still ice. Enslaved people could not openly challenge the overseer's lash, but resistance took myriad forms, subtle, strategic, born from a desperate need to survive under crushing oppression. They slowed their toil, feigning illness with trembling limbs and downcast eyes, stretching out suffering to diminish output without drawing the overseer's immediate wrath. Broken tools left unrepaired, misplaced or dulled by secret fingers, became weapons in a silent war, sabotaging the very machinery of exploitation. Stealing was another measure, born not of greed, but necessity. With meager rations of salted pork and cornmeal, stolen fruits or scraps, harvested quietly from the edges of the fields, meant brief reprieve for hungry children and worn bodies. Yet such acts bore terrible risks. Getting caught could mean brutal punishment or family members torn apart by sale or exile. Resistance was a careful calculus of risk. When was the quiet revolt worth the cost? Whispers of these small insurrections filtered through the quarters, binding communities in shared knowledge and longing, unanswered questions hanging like smoke in the sultry air. More overt defiance flickered in moments of raw courage and desperation. Some refused to rise with the sun or dragged their feet heavier under the overseer's glare. Others sabotaged crops or breached invisible boundaries, the very act of survival doubling as rebellion. Would you dare such defiance when every step might invite a lash or worse? The threat of violence shadowed every act, but so too did the fierce determination to reclaim agency, even in smallest fragments. Stories passed down tell of those who, faced with unspeakable cruelty, chose rebellion with deadly consequences, a reckoning that would ripple outward in unknown ways. The overseer's whip cracked anew, but beneath it, the pulse of resistance beat on, hidden but unyielding. As dusk deepened and the plantation slipped toward ominous quiet, a fragile balance held between terror and hope, submission and revolt, waiting like tinder for a single spark that could ignite change or bury it forever beneath the earth. The overseer's whip cracked again, its sharp report slicing through the humid air, reaffirming an order built on fear and control. Yet beneath this harsh dominion, the enslaved found flickers of power in the smallest acts of rebellion. Resistance in 1863 was seldom grand. It was threaded through whispered defiance and subtle sabotage. To openly challenge the overseer was to invite swift, often lethal reprisal. Yet the enslaved wove a tapestry of resistance through broken tools, slow labor and feigned illness, turning mere endurance into defiance. Records imply these small acts were a universal language among the enslaved, a testament to their relentless will to survive. Hidden behind the rough walls of the quarters, hands once roughened by toil delicately slipped stolen scraps into pockets or secret pouches sewn beneath tattered shirts. Every stolen fruit or root was an act of rebellion, a reclaiming of agency in a world designed to deny it. Would you risk such theft when discovery meant brutal lashes or the removal of loved ones, sent away to distant plantations like exiled shadows? These tiny acts stirred both hope and terror, tilting the balance of power, even if only slightly. The overseer's suspicion always lingered, making each theft a dangerous gamble with fate. Sometimes defiance flickered brighter, an act of outright disobedience, a refusal to rise, deliberate slow work undermining the relentless quotas. Stories passed around cotton fires speak of those who struck back with furor, wounding overseers or burning crops, violent acts born of desperate fury and hunger for freedom. Death or exile awaited such boldness, yet these actions carved deep scars into the planters' system and minds. How far would one go to reclaim control over a body owned by another? The violence of resistance offered a grim mirror to oppression's brutality, an irreversible turn that haunted both oppressor and oppressed. The whip's echo fades, but the pulse of resistance beats on, hidden in the dark soil and whispered in the hush of dusk. What begins as quiet, fractured defiance might one day become a reckoning as fierce and relentless as the lash that forged it. The overseer's cruel grip tightens, yet the seeds of vengeance and freedom lie buried deep, waiting for the moment to sprout into devastating reckoning. The summer of 1863 bore witness to more than the distant thunder of civil war. It seethed with unrest deep in the soil of southern plantations. That same year, amidst the brutal crack of the overseer's whip, murmurs of rebellion grew louder beneath the surface. The Emancipation Proclamation had swept through the land as a bold promise of freedom, yet its reach was limited, mostly an echo for those still shackled deep within Confederate states. The whispered hope it stirred was a fragile flame, often smothered by the weight of present suffering. Accounts suggest that overt insurrections were rare, not for lack of will, but for the ever-watchful eyes and merciless retaliation that awaited those who dared rise. On these plantations, resistance took the shape of calculated defiance and moments of desperate courage. Striking back was a perilous act, often violent, yet deeply coded in the rhythms of survival. An overseer's death from a sudden blow or a burned row of cotton was not a simple act of rage. It was a declaration that control could be wrested, however briefly, from the hands that held the whip. Rumors spread like wildfire of slaves who planned revenge under the cloak of night, who summoned ancient spirits and binding oaths to reclaim dignity stolen by iron and sweat. Would you dare such perilous defiance, knowing capture meant agony or death, your family scattered like dust on the wind? Yet revenge came with no easy justice. The planters' codes were harsh, retributive, and unyielding. The Confederate government, galvanized by fear of revolt, met these acts with swift execution and brutal crackdown, executing suspected insurrectionists as examples. The whip was locked tighter in vengeance's grasp, but just as surely, the stories survived, passed secretly from lips to ears, painting a tapestry of resistance woven with both blood and hope. In the splintered silence, after the overseer's final lash and the plantation's deepest shadows, the pulse of revolt echoed, waiting to surge beyond whispered legend into fearful reality. The past was never buried. It was buried alive, just like the overseer who had once wielded the whip with cruel pleasure. In the deepest shadows of the plantation, where the whip's echo faded but never quite disappeared, the atmosphere quivered with a tension both desperate and electric. It was 1863, the year when the Civil War stalled and surged, and the lives of the enslaved hung precariously between bondage and the faintest flicker of promised freedom. The overseer's brutal lash kept bodies bent, but it could not bend spirits that whispered of revolt, that planned in silence and shadows. Accounts imply that even as the Confederate armies drained men from the fields, the enslaved organized in small, secretive bands, gathering strength from each other's courage. Their resistance was not only defiance, it was survival etched into whispered plans and coded gestures hidden beneath the summer's relentless heat. On this plantation, the fear of rebellion was alive in every furtive glance and hurried gesture. Some enslaved men and women planned escapes that pirouetted close to revolt, liberation intended not solely by flight, but by force if necessity demanded. These whispered conspiracies were tethered to the growing reach of the Union Army, whose advance brought new hope and danger alike. Some found their way to Union lines, escaping the overseer's gaze and the whip's crack, while others quietly prepared to meet violence with violence, their hearts steeled beneath quilted nights of prayer and plotting. Would you have dared to act, knowing that discovery promised not only death, but a rippling punishment that would echo through your kin? The overseer's rule was a brittle facade of control, maintained by terror. More than once, the sudden and brutal deaths of those who resisted sent ripples of silence across the fields, turning the overseer's whip into a tool weighed down by both cruelty and fear. Some say the overseer himself was marked by these moments, his cruelty sharpened not by power alone, but by the palpable fear that his reign could be overturned, even buried beneath the lives he so ruthlessly governed. As night fell, and the overseer's shadow stretched long and distorted across the furrows, one question lingered: was his final fate a whispered act of vengeance, or a nightmare forced into being by the anger he unleashed? The soil beneath the slave quarters awaited the answer, thick with the silence of what was buried alive. The overseer's disappearance rippled through the plantation like a gathering storm. In the wake of whispers and rumors hardening into grim fact, the plantation held its breath. Accounts suggest that one night, seized by fear and fury, the enslaved confronted the man whose whip came not just as punishment, but as an instrument of pleasure and cruelty. Bound with rough hemp rope, dragged from the fields he once ruled over like a dark god, he was buried alive within the very slave quarters where his victims had suffered. This act of vengeance was savage and secretive, a reckoning not recorded in the official ledger, but etched deep into the soil and the oral memory of those who survived. The air grew heavy, with a silence that was both relief and dread. The planter's family tightened control, wary of reprisals and the fragile balance that held the plantation together amidst national chaos. Yet the overseer's brutal reign had left scars too raw to heal quickly. His absence echoed not as liberation, but as a dark wound demanding reckoning. Would justice born from revenge ever be clean or redeemable? In the flickering lamplight of the slave quarters, bodies moved cautiously, shadows deepening. Every creak of floorboard, every whisper in the dark was a testament to lived terror and the murmur of unresolved vengeance. The plantation, shackled to a violent past, now twisted beneath the weight of this secret, the overseer's fate buried, but never forgotten. His cruel pleasure had been his undoing, swallowed by a ground soaked with pain and silence. The whip's final crack transformed into a haunting motif, a symbol of oppression turned back upon its wielder, fraught with moral ambiguity. As dawn bled into the fields, one question hung like smoke in the humid air. In a world where law is absent, who bears the true burden of justice? The summer of 1863 was a crucible of upheaval on southern plantations, where the slow burn of rebellion often simmered just beneath the surface. With many white planters fleeing the advancing Union forces or conscripted into Confederate armies, plantation authority fractured, leaving those left behind, often overseers and trusted servants, to enforce brutal order on enslaved populations. In northeastern Louisiana, for instance, accounts suggest that many enslaved people seized the chaos to reclaim their freedom, escaping to Union lines in growing numbers. This era bore witness not only to individual acts of flight, but also to a wave of resistance rooted in both subtle sabotage and more overt defiance. The presence of Union troops nearby acted as a beacon of hope and an unpredictable catalyst. Some enslaved men and women fled by the hundreds, overwhelming Union camps with their arrival and willingness to enlist as soldiers in the U.S. colored troops. Yet others remained, banding together to resist quietly, breaking tools, feigning illness, slowing work, and sharing whispered stories of revolt. The fear of insurrection haunted overseers, their cruel lashes intended to nip rebellion in the bud, but the true terror lay not only in the punishment handed down, but in the knowledge that resistance was ever present, a silent promise of reckoning. Would you have felt that tension, the palpable weight of survival balanced against the risk of rebellion? Though no grand uprising lit these fields ablaze, the steady pulse of insurgent courage laid the groundwork for change. The overseer's whip cracked often, but so too did the bonds of oppression strain and splinter beneath the weight of a people determined not just to endure, but to be free. And in this unsettled terrain, the story of one overseer's terrible fate whispered through the quarters, a grim marker of what happens when cruelty meets its reckoning beneath unforgiving southern skies. The arrival of the Union Army in the South in 1863 brought seismic shifts to the plantation world, casting a long shadow over the southern landscape of bondage and brutal control. With President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation now law, Union forces became an uneasy army of liberation. Wherever the Bluecoats marched, freedom soon followed, though never without resistance or complication. Plantations once ruled by overseers and planters found themselves destabilized as white owners fled or were conscripted, leaving behind elderly enslaved people and trusted servants to keep menacing order amidst uncertainty. The cotton fields, thick with heat and sweat, bore witness to this disintegration of old power. In northeast Louisiana, for example, Union troops gathered along the Mississippi's west bank, their presence a beacon for those still enslaved. Freed people fled in growing numbers toward these lines, overwhelming Union camps with their arrival. The army, stretched thin, found itself tasked with feeding and sheltering thousands of former slaves, termed contrabands, who now shaped a new social reality. These camps, despite their promise, underscored tensions between liberation and survival, as freed people negotiated new labor systems under Union supervision. Would you know the fear and hope mingled in this liminal space, caught between chains and the unknown? The Union's influence extended beyond military might to psychological liberation. Black men enlisted in the U.S. colored troops, asserting agency and contributing to a broader war for freedom. These acts, though far from universal, marked crucial steps toward breaking the chains of slavery. Yet the plantations, once rigid machines of oppression, now operated amidst fractured authority and fear. Overseers replaced absent planters, clinging to brutality as their last defense. Within this shifting chaos, stories emerged of overseers punished beyond the law, of violence turned inward, of vengeance exacted beneath the slave quarters where secrets buried themselves like roots grasping for soil. The Civil War was not only a battlefield of armies, but a quiet, relentless battle for the soul of a nation. As the Union Army advanced deeper into the Confederate South in 1863, their arrival was a catalyst for upheaval and transformation on plantations long held in bondage. Union soldiers, often accompanied by abolitionists and scouts, such as the famed Harriet Tubman, undertook maneuvers like the daring Combahee River Raid in South Carolina, targeting plantations to dismantle Confederate supply lines and disrupt the war economy. These raids were more than military strategy. They were liberations in motion, enslaved people, long shackled by fear and cruelty, seized these moments to escape into Union lines, swelling the ranks of contrabands protected by federal forces. Thousands were freed in swift succession, their flight unraveling the authority of overseers who once ruled with unchallenged severity. The occupation brought a complex new order. Planters fled or were displaced, their lands and homes often destroyed or confiscated in the chaos. Union military government attempted to manage the now liberated labor on plantations, leasing fields to northern investors or converting plantations into experimental spaces where formerly enslaved people could labor for wages and education. These changes, however, came with tensions and uncertainties. For many formerly enslaved people, the promise of freedom was shadowed by hardship, precarious futures, and the lingering threat of violence from white planters and their allies. Meanwhile, overseers who remained clung to their cruel power as a desperate last defense, enforcing discipline with harsher measures as desperation mounted. Would you stand on these fractured lands, knowing that the old order was crumbling yet uncertain if a new dawn could truly break? The Union presence was a beacon of hope, but also a reminder that true freedom would require more than armies and proclamations. It demanded courage, resilience, and a shattering of centuries-old chains. In this turbulent swirl of occupation and resistance, the story of the overseer buried alive becomes a stark symbol. His fate ties to the upheaval that marked 1863, a plantation system on the brink of collapse, where vengeance, justice, and survival collided beneath the oppressive southern skies. The whip still hung in the air like a threat as the plantation crept toward an uncertain future under Union occupation. In 1863, with the war's tide turning at Vicksburg and Port Hudson, Union forces gained strategic control of the Mississippi River, severing Confederate supply lines and splintering the backbone of the Southern war effort. Where they marched, the plantation system fractured. Many white planters fled, their houses abandoned as the land they once owned passed into new hands. The Union military government stepped in, attempting to impose order upon chaos by leasing plantations to northern investors or experimenting with wage labor systems. These efforts proved uneven, shadowed by struggle and mistrust. The formerly enslaved found themselves navigating this fractured landscape with cautious hope. The so-called Sea Islands, for example, became a stage for the infamous Port Royal experiment, where abolitionists arrived to teach, feed, and support newly freed people. Land was set aside for freedmen, some purchased their own acreage, and schools and churches sprang up amid the wreckage. Yet the promise of autonomy was fragile, perpetually threatened by local hostility and the economic interests of both northern speculators and southern planters bent on reclaiming power. Overseers who remained clung desperately to whatever authority they could command, often resorting to harsher measures to enforce labor and order. Would you stand in these shifting shadows of liberation and resistance, the scent of smoke still thick from burned plantations, wondering what justice truly meant? The occupation was not a pure deliverance, but a liminal space where the lines between freedom and bondage blurred. Vengeance for past cruelties echoed quietly in the soil beneath the slave quarters, where the overseer's final fate lingered like a ghost. The plantation was no longer a simple place of labor and mastery, but a complex battleground for control, memory, and redemption, the very ground where the past wrestled with the future beneath the weight of a single cruel whip. Behind the boundaries of shattered plantations in 1863, a new order began to take shape among the ruins of the old. The Union Army's occupation brought with it not just soldiers and gunboats, but a fragile promise of freedom and a wrenching roadmap of social transformation. Union expeditions like the Combahee River Raid carved into the Confederacy's once secure coastal plantations, destroying property and, more importantly, liberating hundreds of enslaved people who eagerly joined the Union cause. Under the leadership of figures like Harriet Tubman and Colonel James Montgomery, these raids tore the fabric of plantation power, scattering planters and overseers alike. Harsh realities quickly settled in. The plantations, stripped of their owners and exiled overseers, became contested spaces. Federal officials, eager to stabilize the area, leased vast tracts of abandoned cotton fields to northern investors or turned them into experimental labor grounds where freed people might work and be paid for the first time. Yet this experiment was uneven and fraught. Competition for resources, lingering racism, and war weariness complicated every attempt at justice. Many formerly enslaved found themselves navigating a precarious new life, caught between the remnants of oppression and the promises of emancipation. Would you have felt hope or suspicion in such uncertain times, the scent of burning fields thick in the air? Meanwhile, overseers who remained clung desperately to power, ruling with intensified cruelty born of fear and desperation. Their dominion was marked by tightening discipline and savage reprisals, even as they watched their world unravel. The story of the overseer buried alive amidst the slave quarters emerges from this turbulent intersection of violence and transformation. His end symbolizes a reckoning not only with personal cruelty, but with a system collapsing under the weight of emancipation's promise. This soil, scented with smoke, sweat, and salt, holds the tangled legacy of pain, resistance, and the fragile birth of freedom. The final reckoning begins with a whisper of earth giving way, a hand bound tight in rough, coarse rope, dirt clinging wet and dark beneath fingernails, strangling the overseer's breath as the soil swallows him slowly within the slave quarters. It is an act born from centuries of torment, wreathed in fiery resentment, where vengeance is meted in silence and shadows. The overseer, once a merciless master of pain and pleasure, wielding his whip with cruel delight, meets the grave he forced countless others to dig. His fate, while harsh and brutal, swings the balance in a world where law is silent and justice is carved from lived memory. The quarters themselves bear witness, their worn planks soaked with the weight of oppression, the texture of sweat and salt mingling with the earthy scent of freshly turned soil. Each floorboard echoes with muffled breaths and hurried shuffles as the enslaved seal this grim verdict beneath the earth. Here lies the embodiment of rage restrained too long, the whip turned inward. Would you grasp at vengeance when survival demanded silence, knowing that what is buried may yet rise as a haunting reckoning? This burial is no mere punishment. It is a message writ dark and deep in the ground itself, a final whispered refusal of cruelty's dominion. The soil closes over him, sealing the overseer in a tomb not marked by stone, but by the silence of the quarters. The whip's cruel memory lingers, a symbol of power turned deadly, oppression's echo beneath the feet of those who once bore its weight. As the plantation holds this secret beneath the heavy southern heat and long shadows, a greater question remains unanswered. When the law is absent, when cruelty invites vengeance, what form can justice truly take? The earth beneath the slave quarters holds its breath, keeping its terrible secret, waiting for the day when it might speak again.